Welcome, everyone. Welcome. We have a wonderful guest today at the Life Sciences Trends podcast. This is episode 2, and I'm glad to welcome Mr. Siva, who has a very extensive wealth of experience within life sciences. He's on his second venture, not his first. And in order to make sure I don't give himself a disservice, can you please introduce yourself for the listeners today?
Thank you, Val, and thanks again for the opportunity. My name is Siva Nadarajah. I've been in the life sciences industry for almost 25 years now. Mostly I worked in pharmaceutical companies, helping pharma in the launch of drugs and also medical devices. So I did not work directly for pharma companies, but I worked for a company which helped pharma companies and medical device companies launch drugs. I was in the launch teams of Botox. I was in the launch teams of Viagra. I was in the launch team of Lyrica, some of the largest drugs that you would normally see. And in 2010, I quit my last job and I started my first venture. It was an AI-based drug and vaccine safety monitoring software that was needed at that time for various compliance reasons for various companies. And that product grew very well, that company, and we got acquired by IQVIA, one of the largest clinical research companies in the world, with some 80 and 90,000 employees now, and they make $12 to $13 billion in revenue. So my company was acquired by IQVIA, and I led IQVIA's AI business within the safety portfolio. And interestingly, that software that we developed and sold to IQVIA is currently used by some of the largest pharmaceutical and vaccine manufacturers like Moderna to monitor the vaccine safety in this pandemic, right? So then I was at IQVIA for almost 6 years, and I met these researchers from NYU who had developed JOGO, which essentially a sensor-based technology which can rewire your central nervous system to recover from stroke, chronic pain, and various neuromuscular conditions. And I became an investor in the company originally. Then just before the pandemic, I quit my last job and started just joined the company as a co-founder to take it to commercial. So that's my background, Alan.
Yeah, wonderful. And I'm just very curious and excited to learn a bit more about the full process going into some of these ventures. As someone who's founded not just one but two, firms within this field so far, definitely strike me as an entrepreneurial person. Can you explain a bit more of the full process that went inside? What led you to found the first venture which was looking at the safety side of therapies?
Yeah, it's always difficult to leave a comfortable corporate job and start a company, right? Because you lose your paycheck from day one. Because nobody pays you from day one to start a company. So, but it was an interesting journey because I found a problem that existed in the industry. Actually, I was even pitching this to my management at that time, and hey, let's go build this, because there was a need. A little bit of background why that company was started, right? So, if you remember the previous pandemic, supposed to be the pandemic, the H1N1 virus. So during that pandemic, there were some drugs that were developed, and apparently nobody monitored the side effects of these drugs, right, at that time. It's not that those drugs were not safe, but apparently there were some side effects that were reported by these. Later on, they found out in 2008, they found out, where the H1N1 virus was in 2004, I think. So there was this mass amount of data that got collected over a period of time, and they had no way to go back and look at who actually had side effects in these drugs, right? It was impossible for human beings to look at data that was in billions of records, right? So there was a need for a software to go back and look at all the side effects. And AI was not even a term at that time. There was, of course, AI as a concept existed, but nobody called it AI. If you remember in 2010, it was natural language processing, machine learning, and deep learning. Those are some of the terms that were used. So I thought there was a need, and I thought I will start this company by, overnight. One day I decided to quit my job and launch this company with no money, thinking that somebody will fund me, but nobody funded me in the beginning. So it was a struggle for 18 months. Then finally we found, I had a great co-founder. He was able to help me through the journey at that point. And then we eventually found traction and revenue, and we did not even need venture funding at that time. We got acquired, before even we really took venture funding. So it is always 50-50 chance of whether your entrepreneur journey will be successful. I was lucky. So my second one wasn't that difficult, because once you launch your first one, and it's easy to attract investors for second one, also you yourself can fund the company. So but my first one was really a struggle. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I think as with many things, the very first initial stages can be a bit more of a harder process, whether that's starting a new venture, or even within medical research. Sometimes diving into like a new therapy area, for example, can be a bit hard to get the traction off the ground in those initial phases. But once that momentum builds up and there's more evidence that things can be done, it's a lot easier to get the process snowballing. But I really find it fascinating, the work that you did there in terms of applying AI, because I know and I understand that AI is often used as quite a big buzzword, because it is a fascinating technology in terms of use cases within life sciences and healthcare, but also across various different fields. But I really do see AI as something which is a tool that can be used not just within the initial phases of, let's say, like R&D, in research, drug discovery, drug development, but also both within that spectrum, beyond that spectrum, in terms of after a drug is really being developed. But in the case that you just mentioned, being able to sift through large volumes of data to find out information which pertains to safety, which if we were to do mechanically, manually, would be rather time consuming, and maybe not the most possible or viable, for simple terms. But yeah, shifting a bit from that first venture to JOGO, I'm really interested about the capabilities of JOGO and how this is impacting digital health. Could you please explain, I guess in simple terms, what a JOGO Health is and its main product is, and some of the disease areas that it is targeted?
Sure. So JOGO originated at NYU, New York University here, and it was developed by a well-known neurologist and a physical medicine and rehabilitation doctor called Joseph Rodney. He's late Joseph Rodney. He was 94 years. He passed. So he worked with an engineer called Gordon Silverman, Dr. Gordon Silverman. That's where the name comes from, JOGO, Joseph and Gordon. JOGO, we named the company. So the Gordon Silverman is famously known for creating the world's first automated toll booth systems in New York City. So basically, a sensor-based technology in the 1950s to collect toll automatically, right, from the highways. So he was a sensor-based guy he was one of the early pioneers in sensor-based technology. So both of them developed JOGO basically using a foundational science called neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity is your brain can be rewired. So a great example of neuroplasticity is, since you're in London, the London taxi drivers. So London taxi drivers, they have to memorize the map before they get a license, right? No other country does that. They have to memorize the entire map. So Harvard Medical School did a study on London taxi drivers, and they actually did fMRI scans on the London taxi drivers, And they found that the area of the brain which stores the spatial information, which is the map, is larger than regular human beings, right, in all the London taxi drivers. So that kind of shows the brain can be rewired by training, right? Our brain changes every day, but if you specifically focus on certain tasks, then that part of the brain can be rewired, which is neuroplasticity. So what JOGO does is it uses a sensor, it's a wearable sensor, that reads the electricity from the muscle. So electromyography, that's the muscle. Our body produces electricity. And it feeds it back to the brain, right? It feeds it back to the brain. And we have machine learning algorithms and all these buzzwords I don't want to use, but basically it tells the brain to rewire. So let's take an example of a stroke patient, right? So if someone, God forbid, had a stroke, you get a blood clot in the brain, and that part of the brain which now controls your muscles or your upper extremity, your hand or leg, now cannot operate. Now that's why people get paralysis, right? So there's a blood clot, there's an accident in the brain. Your brain, those two neurons which are connecting these two neurons which are actually connected to work with the muscles, can be rerouted by training the brain, right? So what we do, we put the sensor on the hand or leg, wherever it's the impacted, and we have an app which runs on a tablet PC where the patient has to look at, and it trains the brain using certain protocol exercises that we have patented, and that's what sort of our IP is, which works, which basically trains the brain, and people get control back, right? After a lot of exercise. It's not like it doesn't happen overnight. You need to do very much like how the London taxi drivers memorize the map. It doesn't overnight, right? They have to take a lot of steps to do that. So typically after about 4 weeks of, say, 6 weeks, we see great results from patients who had stroke, right? Recovering from this. The second piece of JOGO is actually working with chronic pain. Chronic pain being, let's say someone had a back pain or they fell and they had a back injury. You go through physical therapy, sometimes you go through surgery, and you fix a pathological problem in the body, right? But you see 2/3 of the patients still have pain. There's no underlying pathological reasons, but they still have pain, right? It's called non-specific low back pain. That's what triggers the opioid crisis in the United States, and probably in the UK, it triggers all kinds of other other addictions, right? So it's a brain-related pain, right? Did the video froze, Alan? Can you hear me?
I think I can still hear it to you.
Yeah, sorry. So take a chronic pain, for example, chronic low back, any chronic pain. So the brain and it's a neural signaling problem. The brain have become too sensitive, or there is residual memory in the brain about the pain, so the brain is not going to let go, right? But then that creates muscle tension in the body, right? And the muscle tension is a vicious cycle that feeds it back to the brain, and there's anxiety builds up. So there is a pain, anxiety, muscle tension builds up. In chronic pain, chronic low back pain, cancer pain, you take any other chronic pain, right? So what JOGO does is you put these sensors again in this body, depending on which muscle you're working on, and we reduce the muscle tension by telling the brain to reduce the muscle tension. We give relaxation exercises to the brain, and the brain naturally relaxes the muscles, right? And we have shown that in studies at Harvard Medical School here that this can reduce pain better than opioids. So we did a study, and it's permanent. You don't need to use it every day. It's permanent. Once you do it, it's done, right? So chronic pain, migraine, tension type headache, chronic pelvic pain, fibromyalgia pain, all these can be treated. So it's actually the opposite of what you do with stroke, really. Stroke, you are trying to recruit the muscles, you bring the muscles back. And here in the pain, you're letting the brain forget about the tension in the brain and in the muscles and let it go, right? So it's a very new science when it comes to this it's not a new science, the old science, but now resurrected, right? This has been studied for 40, 50 years, this whole science, right? That you can actually train your central nervous system through this feedback process. And a lot of different applications came in. It falls under something called electromyography, biofeedback, that's been studied. But what we do here is very unique how we create these protocols, and the treatment can be provided remotely, so the patients don't have to come to clinics. So this whole app. It's an app you download, and there's a sensor. We ship it to the patients, and they do it at home with some support from the clinicians. So so that's basically how, those are some of the conditions we treat. So the other conditions we treat with JOGO, we talked about stroke, we talked about chronic pain. The third one is pelvic floor disorders, right? So especially women who develop urinary incontinence postpartum. So, during a childbirth, there is trauma, and now the brain and the pelvic muscles have forgotten how to work together, right? Now this connection is gone. So they develop incontinence, they can't control bladder. It happens with men as well when they age, and also men who go through prostate surgery when the brain and the muscles are now not talking to each other. So we can re-educate that process back again by putting the sensors in the pelvic area and re-educate the brain, and so we can treat incontinence in both men and women, right? So that's also something that we do with JOGO. So the last one we're working on right now is Parkinson's. So JOGO doesn't treat Parkinson's. JOGO can actually help the brain relax and stop the tremors. So we can help the brain stop the tremors. So we are seeing some really good results, sometimes in some cases 90% reduction, average 70% reduction in tremors in patients. So we've actually worked with the UK Parkinson's group. Those are one of our first partners based in UK. We did a small trial recently, and it showed that JOGO can reduce tremors. And by reducing tremors, we are actually improving sleep in Parkinson's patients, which is one of the major issues with many Parkinson's patients. They can't sleep because they have tremor, and that leads to anxiety, and it's again a whole cycle, right? So those are some four areas that we are working on: stroke, chronic pain, including migraine, and pelvic floor disorders like incontinence, and then Parkinson's. So,
yeah, fascinating. And just touched upon some of those like therapy areas that you mentioned. Just starting with stroke, for example, I've heard that every 2 seconds someone is suffering from a stroke. So stroke is absolutely massive, and having parts of the brain which are essentially being damaged due to lack of oxygen, and being able, from the sound of things, to redirect your neural networks to reach a part of the brain which the body was struggling to reach through a different path. I think that's a massive application. It's going to have a tremendous impact.
Yeah. I would recommend people to watch this TED video, which is on our website, which explains how fascinating. We're just scratching the surface at this point with brain science, right? Because until the fMRI scans came in, we never knew how powerful the brain can be, and how powerful the brain rewiring can be, right? Neuroplasticity. We always understood neuroplasticity, naturally, right? That brain can be changed. Tennis, if you start practicing for 10,000 hours, you actually get a good swing, and 10,000 hours. I forgot what the number was, but now we can see in the brain actual structural changes in the brain, right? Because the short-term memories and things that we do, they are stored. Let's say you go play tennis one day, and you think you got your service right, but you go 2 days later, you're awful, right? That is because the chemical changes are the ones that happen in the brain, not the structural changes. But with neuroplasticity, the more you practice, you actually can change structurally the brain, right? So that is, in tennis. The same thing can be done with stroke patients. Where we actually train the brain, right? Through this process. So yeah, you're just scratching the surface. And I was fascinated. Some of the neurology textbooks are just getting expanded on neuroplasticity and the whole process of feedback. It's just a small chapter in neurology books until recently, when students study medicine.
It's a important fact, and like you said, the fact that things are really just getting started in terms of what we're learning about neuroplasticity just makes things even more exciting. I personally find it really interesting that you mentioned how, in the case of stroke, is trying to rebuild some of those connections, where you can also engineer the reverse in terms of chronic pain, where we're basically trying to release some of those connections to parts of the brain which are linked to, I guess, feelings which we want to kind of dissociate from.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the whole chronic pain use case in my eyes is quite a massive thing, because it's not only treating this chronic pain, but it's also providing an alternative solution to the opioids, as you mentioned, and working within the whole professional services and consulting fields. I've worked with some biotech, for example, who are looking to essentially create non-opioid like pain relief alternative, because it is a massive massive.
1 in 5, Alan, 1 in 5 adults in the world suffer from chronic pain, right? And we've talked to doctors, there's nothing else they could provide, and it's like, what do you do, right? You can't prescribe opioids, and in UK even gabapentin, right? That's getting phased out in 2025, I think, because they saw that that's not doing anything to the brain. It's just placebo effect. So it's not treating the root cause. So there's nothing out there for these patients, right? So we feel that chronic pain is a big area that we will focus. We are seeing great results. We did a clinical study, our RCT at Brigham and Women's at Harvard Medical School. Fantastic results. So yes, yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. And just to say as well, I know you mentioned previously that with some of these patients and use cases, it's not like an overnight thing, but with the example you gave with stroke, being able to have massive results in 4 to 6 weeks, I think that is, in my opinion, quite fast. But that's quite a fast.
I'll give you a story, Alan. It's patient stories what encourages me every day to wake up in the morning and run for this job. So there was a UCLA professor, right? The UCLA, where one of the famous professors at UCLA had a stroke during the pandemic. And, UCLA has one of the best, University of California, LA, right? UCLA. So they have one of the best rehab, and he went through the regular rehabilitation. His ADLs were fine, but he still lost the ability to write, right? Because his hands were gone like this, and he's paralyzed here, and he also could not walk. So, basically the rehab said, that's it, that's the maximum we could do, and, go home, and that's the end of your teaching career, right? You cannot write. So he found out about us, and he called us, and we worked with his physical therapist who was helping him, and we shipped a JOGO kit. This just happened a month ago. And after 6 weeks, he opens up, right? His hands opened up, and he's now back in school teaching, this famous UCLA professor. So it's life-changing when it comes to stroke, right? When patients don't have anything else. We are very... as I said, we're just scratching the surface, right? Not every stroke patient is a candidate for stroke, for JOGO, because if someone had lost the ability to see, if they become blind, right, JOGO doesn't work because you need to look at the screen. So that is an important factor. The feedback goes visually to the brain. So that's an important, because if you're working on other ways to put maybe through sound or whatever, right? So, but right now, it's a stroke I think every 40 seconds in the United States, someone has a stroke.
Wow.
Every 40 seconds.
Every 4 seconds.
Yeah.
And honestly, like you said, I think use cases like that and case studies where you're actually seeing this tangible, massive impacts on people's lives really showcases how genuinely impactful these technologies are.
Yeah.
Having someone in an example who's a lecturer who, in one scenario, without struggle, without any way to improve after stroke and be able to write, would literally have to end his lecturing career, to now with JOGO Health being able to go back to his career and not have to make a massive lifestyle change is really impactful. It also reminds me of another story I think I've heard you share in the past, where I think one of your friend's daughter had like cerebral palsy, and essentially JOGO Health was also used in that scenario as well. Are you able to kind of like share that example?
Can you repeat, Alan? Which one? Which one?
Yeah, no worries. I believe there's one of your friends, their daughter has cerebral palsy, and with JOGO Health was able to essentially bring it to the stage where she was able to by herself like walk to the restroom.
Oh, yeah. It's daughter. So, this is a cerebral palsy child, right? So cerebral palsy essentially is a pediatric, you know, stroke that happens during the childbirth. Oxygen doesn't go to the brain, and the brain gets damaged, and you get cerebral palsy, right? Mostly it happens during the childbirth. Some of them at birth or even pre-birth also, they say. But yeah, this child, she was 13 years old when we treated her, and she could not walk to the bathroom. So her dad carries her to the bathroom. Remember, imagine a child with a 13-year-old teenager, dad carrying to the bathroom. So their goal was basically, can this child at least walk to the bathroom, right, by herself? We cannot see completely cured cerebral palsy with JOGO. We can make great improvements, actually. So she had the same issue, spasticity. So one of the biggest things she had was, the face drops in the chin drops for the cerebral palsy children. That's one. Second is the foot drop, where they cannot walk, right? They need help. So we worked on both of them. And this also gets 6 to 8 weeks, I think, treatment. And she, her chin went up and she started walking with some support. And for the first time, she walked to the bathroom, right? So the dad doesn't have to carry her. So these are amazing stories of, children. And there was another child, I even had a video. For 4 years, he could not walk. He was intellectually bright child, 4-year-old. He walked for the first time with a walker, but still, he won't even, his legs will just topple before, right? But now he could stand and walk with a walker. But the joy in his face was like, that's you wake up and say, okay, mission accomplished, for my company. When you see these children.
And that's the thing. It's really impact almost on like a stereotypically like biblical scale, where the lame can walk almost in a way, and it reminds me of some of the use cases of gene therapies in some rare diseases, for example, where in some cases you can have a patient who is blind who now with this treatment can literally see, and you can imagine, like you said, seeing the smile on that person's face, seeing the impact that you've brought to their life, is really hard to even capture in.
Yeah, it is. It's amazing. Yeah, I have seen the gene therapy with Duchenne muscular dystrophy children, right? Yeah. JOGO cannot treat DMD, but I've seen Duchenne muscular dystrophy children with gene therapy, because we get involved in JOGO post gene therapy for rehabilitation, to help them do proper rehab for post gene therapy. But I have seen children who never thought they would walk with DMD. Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, that's what really motivates you to be in the life sciences industry, that you're changing lives.
Yeah, precisely. And on that point, just touching on something you mentioned in terms of chronic pain, again, massively impact the fields. I read from a previous jobbers LinkedIn page that they're using both AI and VR technology, and I know that VR technology is something which has been implementing to treat pain, both being examined to the chronic pain, but also sudden pain as well. Can you kind of dive in a bit more in terms of how VR technology is being used within the space?
Sure. So we do have a VR component to JOGO, but our mechanism of action is different from the other VR systems that you see. So again, pain, when it comes to chronic pain, even acute pain, right? A distraction can be a huge thing for pain. So when you are in pain, people who watch movies, they normally don't feel pain. Then after the movie, they suddenly feel pain, right? So VR could be a huge distraction mechanism. That's one way VR is used in acute pain. So in post-op pain, by giving them VR relaxation exercises, they are forgetting or rethinking about something else. So the pain is not a disease, right? Pain is a signal from the brain. So anything you could do to the signal So that's one way they are treating pain with VR. It's a distraction mechanism. The second one they do, like companies like Applied VR, there's a company here. They do cognitive behavior therapy using VR. So cognitive behavior therapy is also shown to help with patients with chronic pain, even chronic lower back pain patients that we treat. Cognitive behavior therapy can be complementary to what we do, right? So pain is a multimodal treatment, but there's no one solution. So CBT is basically you talk to the patient and think about, some of them have like residual thoughts and that causes the pain for them. So CBT is it's talk therapy. You talk to them and give them certain exercises to do, not physical but mental exercises. But that is programmed into VR, and that has also shown to reduce pain. So that's one way they're treating pain. One is purely a distraction mechanism. The second is giving cognitive behavior therapy. In our case, we don't have a FDA cleared VR yet. Our regular product is FDA cleared, not the VR one. So our VR version of our product is, instead of looking at a screen on an app, you are looking at a game in a VR, but the process is the same, right? So, for example, in our case, we ask the patients to bring your muscle tension from here to here, and there are some basic exercises that are given to the patient. They could bring the muscle tension here to here. In our app, they're looking at a straight line or a ball or something. In a VR, they're having a nicer game. They're sending a dart, or they're playing, eating bubble gum. It's another way to engage the patient. So that's one issue with digital therapeutics. It's not a pill, right? You have to put effort to work on it. So even on a stroke patient. And some days it's funny that when we talk to some stroke patients and they have this clenched hands for dystonia, you put the sensor and say, okay, try to move. And some patients say, that's why I came to you, I can't move. I said, try, right? So that engagement, when it has gamification in it, it's much more fun for patients. So yeah, that's the two angles that I look at VR. One is a distraction mechanism, mostly for acute pain. For chronic pain, is cognitive behavior therapy on a VR.
Yeah, and thanks so much for diving into that. It seems like it's a case of taking that proprietary JOGO Health software applications from the app, but essentially applying it in a much more immersive environment where it's even more fun, it's even more interactive.
Yeah.
And perhaps easier to use. Very interesting. And so continue on. I have to ask, as someone who has a wealth of experience working within life sciences and also AI, and also having that like technical software engineering background as well, to further edify the skills. From your perspective, what would you say are some of the biggest trends, the most impactful trends, within the whole life sciences and healthcare field as a whole?
Yeah, so there are many things. Of course, in the life sciences, biggest trend is gene and cell therapy, right? That is, we are seeing the early success of it in many disease conditions. I am very fascinated about the gene therapy and the cell therapy area, and mRNA and the applications of mRNA, not in vaccines, but now we're talking about cardiovascular and other things. So there's a whole mRNA, cell therapy, gene therapy that I am very fascinated about because I came from pharma. That is a trend. I think we're going to see some fantastic applications in that area. On the other trends, which I'm included right now, part of it's digital therapeutics. We're going to see success like JOGO and many other companies complementing these drugs that are going to come out, and also sometimes replacing. In our case, chronic pain, we are basically replacing opioids, which everybody is happy with, right? Nobody wants to. Even companies that were in opioid business have exited the business. So there are some applications, like even incontinence, for example. In our case, we are seeing patients not needing medications anymore after they go through JOGO's treatment, and also avoiding surgery. So there's going to be some interesting angle coming in from cell gene therapy, mRNA, and digital therapeutics coexisting, right? Because we cannot cure cancer with digital therapeutics, right? It has to be, there are only certain things we could do with digital therapeutics. Anything to do with the brain and muscles in our case. And we cannot go right into the cell, not yet. So I think this is going to be the two trends that are coming in, and there are going to be probably some combo therapies coming up where you're going to have a digital component to an app, to a life sciences product. I see that as something that's happening. There are a lot of still unknowns. They're hard to predict many of these things, but where we are seeing traction right now, end of the day, physicians have to trust what you're building, and physicians have to have data. So you cannot just go claim this can do this and that until you have data. So we are very focused on evidence, right? So I think the next frontier in digital health is going to be evidence. Evidence is going to be the frontier, because there are many companies who came in and they said, they did not have proper evidence. Nobody did a randomized controlled trials. So I think the digital health and digital therapeutics will have a baby, and they will say, okay, digital health is where you scale, and digital therapeutics is going to bring you this evidence that is needed, right? in the digital space, digital and digital therapeutic space. Because I was at a conference last week in New York, and clearly from physicians, they said without evidence, they are not going to touch this, right? Yeah. So that is very, very important. And we are very focused on, I came from pharma. I know how much evidence matters. You can convince maybe 3-4 doctors, but if you want to go to the entire key opinion leaders, and if you don't have evidence, you're going to fail eventually, right? Eventually, you're going to fail. Because people will say this is smoke and mirrors, like cryptocurrency.
Cryptocurrency is a hot topic as well. I was contemplating whether I should include it as a thought point, but I thought I'll check out cryptocurrency. But I think absolutely right. I think evidence is a massive thing, because even when it comes to, for example, some of the startups within the like AI space within life sciences, I think it was at the recent conference where I heard that many investors now are focusing heavily on not just these startups which have good technology, good software, but ones which actually have evidence that there's a good solid use case for the products. So I think that's a massive field, and just bouncing on and continuing on for what you said about digital healthcare being, and digital therapeutics being a large trend in life sciences. One thing I do appreciate a lot about this field, especially in this, I guess, COVID kind of scenario, like, well, I were in or just about to exit firm or exited firm, the fact that many of these digital therapeutics can be used remotely. So I think, remote medicine, telemedicine is massive, and you've mentioned a few times within this discussion that many of these patients that you worked with JOGO Health have been cases of remote treatment, and I think that's quite powerful, because you can have two people in within a right regulatory framework. You can have two people in completely different locations and still be able to drive that massive impact, regardless of that geographical previous restriction, now being able to freely be able to treat people further based.
Yeah, Alan. So two examples I'll give you. In the United States, 65 to 75% of patients who need rehab do not complete rehab because they don't have access to rehab. So think about a stroke patient in a minority community living somewhere with no access. In some places, they have to go grocery stores. They have to go 4 or 5 miles, right? Think about there's a rehab facility, right? And they don't get proper rehab. So yeah, the reach of digital therapeutics. Now I can ship a kit to some part of the United States where there is no doctor nearby in the next 400 miles, let alone a rehab facility. I can treat this patient remotely, right, from a hub. somewhere in the same state because you can't stay from out of state in the United States because state licensing comes in. But regardless, you can treat a patient remotely, but you can give clinically superior treatment. So JOGO is clinically superior to regular rehab, right? In stroke. But on top of it, it can be delivered to any part of the world, right? And we were talking to the other day with an NGO who wants to take it to Africa. In some places there's no rehab at all, right? I grew up in Sri Lanka. So, where I grew up, I have never seen a physical therapist. There's no physical therapist, right? There was one primary care doctor. Then I found out he was not even a doctor. He was a pharmacist. He called himself a doctor. So I grew up in the tea plantations, right? So there was nobody there. So think about this can now reach places like that. When you could have an expert from New York treating a patient in Sri Lanka. It actually happened. We recently treated Parkinson's patients in Sri Lanka from the United States with JOGO, shipping a kit, and with fantastic results. And the second fascinating one is, Andaman Nicobar Islands in India, like one remote part where it's like closer to Indonesia. There's a set of islands, Andaman Nicobar Islands. Some of the untouched tribal areas are there still. So we treated a patient for urinary incontinence from India, one of the cities, remotely. So you can reach, as you're right, you can. This is the nice thing about digital therapeutics, where you can treat patients. It can reach patients, right, in places that normally you would not be able to provide. And it's also not expensive like medicine, right? There are other pharmaceutical medications, so it's cheap.
Yeah, you're right. I think it's cheaper. The reach can be, in many cases, far wider, and
Right.
Also inherently, since it's a digital therapeutic, it's probably going to develop and adapt naturally over time. The more patients that it works with, and it's interesting that the use cases you use about fitting someone with those conditions in India, for example, it relates back to something which I think is a big theme within lifestyle and healthcare, which is the whole access and affordability piece, being able to help improve that access and affordability in places where it's not necessarily the same. One for example, growing up in a place where there was only one doctor, to say he was actually a pharmacist. It's it can be a big game changer. And actually, on that very same thought, a question I would like to ask yourself is, looking at life sciences and healthcare as a whole, in your eyes and in your thoughts, what would you say are one or some of the biggest challenges within the field? And if someone gave you an unlimited budget, so like every, I guess, every time you press a button, you get thrown, $10 million, let's say, and there's no expiry date or expiration to that. How would you kind of look towards addressing that?
The challenge that I see, the major challenge that we have run into, Alan, is in the United States, especially with the regulation and payers, right? I don't know whom to blame. Payers are also inundated with so many digital health technologies and things that they don't have time to evaluate. But this concept of a third party responsible for paying, it's just slow, and it just limits access. So in our case, we are cleared by FDA, right? But still, we cannot reach a large amount of patients in every state. In the United States, there's so many different regulations, confusing regulations. I probably have 4 law firms working with us, trying to figure out, are we doing the right thing? Nobody can give me an answer. The laws are confusing, no straightforward laws. I don't know whether you're familiar with the United States laws. There's a thing called corporate practice of medicine, where a private company cannot administer medication, But when you look at it, every single medical decision is made by an insurance company in the United States, which is basically for profit. So doctors were told what to do, basically by an insurance company, but they're saying you as a startup cannot have direct patient care. But we were like, change the law, and like, how did you allow pharmaceutical companies or for-profit companies to develop drugs? Like, you had a regulatory body, monitor them, have them do the right thing. Otherwise, I agree that corporates are profit and they'll mess it up. This is what really prohibiting us from giving this treatment to patients, because for pharma it took like 200 years. I think they figured out how to deliver this, and there's a payment model and everything is settled. For digital health, the payment system has not been settled, so it's very, very hard. Not everybody has the money to pay out of pocket. So that is the biggest challenge. So if someone gives me money, I will probably use it for lobbying to go talk to the government. Because we are ready to solve the other problems. We're like, but it's crazy. We spend $2,000 on some expensive items, but when it comes to Medicare, we expect the government to pay for it or someone else to pay for it, right? That's just human behavior in the Western world. People don't want to pay out of pocket for care. But the guy who's paying for it is someone else, right? How do I convince them with even so much of evidence that we have, so much of data that we have, still I can get a meeting with, for example, Blue Cross Blue Shield in the United States. Nobody will pick up your phone. There's no way. Nobody knows how to reach them unless you know the CEO of the company, right? That's the most frustrating part for me. Access to payers, and there's no proper way to evaluate digital technologies. The second thing is this confusing laws, right? That are, I'm talking about US, I haven't come to UK yet. I don't know what I'm running into. So this is really prohibiting us. It's delaying the access, and it's sometimes killing some of the startups. Some of them are going by giving up with some. I know a company which developed a really good caregiver model for Alzheimer's. They just went out of business because they could not get reimbursement, and that company just died, right? So this is the most challenging part in digital health, digital therapeutics, at least, right?
Yeah. And yeah, I can imagine how, if I can put it worse, frustrating it can be where you have a really good product and really good technology behind it as well, but due to some like regulatory issue, there's the struggle to get it to where it needs to be. And within the realms of digital health, why do you think this is a big problem within digital health? Do you think it's because digital health is relatively new or early in terms of its addition to clouds? I know that sometimes where technologies are quite new, there's a bit of a slow adoption or clarity within regulations.
So not an adoption thing, Alan. It's essentially no other industry in the world has a third-party payer, right? Everything that you consume, you pay, right? You go buy something on Amazon, you pay. You go purchase a meal at a restaurant, you pay. No one else is paying for you, right? Healthcare is the only thing that's a third-party payer. There's someone else who's paying for you, although you are the consumer, right? That someone else has a different interest, vested interest than you. That's a concern. They want to save the budget. They rarely care about what really patients want. I mean, that's unfortunate. That's how it's set up because healthcare is expensive, right? So that is the issue, because a lot of the technologies, the way it took off, any consumer technology, this takes off like crazy, right? Because the end customer is the one who's paying for it, whereas in healthcare is the third party who is paying for it, has different incentives than the actual patient, right? So, it's a kind of a very complex circle that these guys don't have the time or the willingness to look at something like this, which would benefit the patient. So that's why you need, as I said, if I have the money, I'll go to lobby, right? It requires real education. We were actually in Capitol Hill last 3 months ago, the Digital Therapeutic Alliance, and we have like a bunch of companies. We formed an alliance, went and educated the lawmakers in the United States about what is this and why you should be paying for it, why it can solve the opioid crisis, why even someone in your in your constituency can recover from a stroke and they can go back to work. And, lawmakers, they have a lot of things to do. So it's not about it's new, because many other technologies that are even advanced than this, I always come back to crypto, which nobody understood what it was, but it became a huge thing, right? Yeah. Because why? Government didn't pay for it. End people that just messed it up. Part of the problem was regulated, but still, things that are even completely unknown to people are taking off, right? But this is something you have evidence, you have randomized control trials, your data. Now you're still sitting with, who's going to pay for it, right? So that is the biggest challenge I think I see in digital health. It's changing that Germany is pretty good at this. I think Germany is the first country to come up with their own digital formulary. I think there's going to be pressure, and patient advocacy groups are going to play a role. So we work closely with, the Parkinson's associations to push for this. And also sometimes physicians too, they love to have prescribings to patients. The first question that they ask is it covered by Medicare? Is it covered by insurance, right? I mean, nobody wants to prescribe something that is cash to patient. Yeah. So you have the patients want it, the physicians want to prescribe it, the key opinion leaders want it, but the guys who want to pay for it are really behind looking at this, right?
It is fascinating because it goes back to something I mentioned in the previous discussion in one of the other episodes, which is that you can have a wonderful product, you can have wonderful technology behind it, but it is one part of the equation, and then sometimes something which on the surface is as seemingly simple as the payment side of things itself can be a big, I guess in some cases a limitation, or some cases something which could be optimized. And even within the UK, I know the UK has quite a different healthcare payment structure to the US.
So we went to some cash markets, Alan. So we are operating in India. India is 100% cash market. There's no insurance in India for healthcare. Corporate employees get insurance for hospitalization. That's the only insurance that exists. Anything inpatient. Drugs are out of pocket for patients. Anything outpatient services out of pocket for patients. So we are very successful in India because it's a cash market. And that kind probably can tell a story. But unfortunately, in the United States, even a $5 generic pill is paid by the government or paid by the insurance. Sometimes the copay is higher than that, but it's just a psychological thing of somebody has to pay for my medication. As is prohibiting here.
It's very interesting. Touching on and continuing from some of the points you mentioned, I know I know that JOGO Health has a presence within the US, I believe New York, and also within India as well. You mentioned that Germany has quite a good, I guess, regulatory framework for digital health therapies. Are there any plans in the now or long term to build like a strong presence within Europe by any chance, or is it mainly kind of
Europe? So we are definitely looking at our strategy to go to market, Alan. We look at the countries where the payment systems are established, right? Either it has to be a cash market like India, or in some other countries, like we're looking at closely looking at Indonesia, which is another cash market which is pretty large, growing much faster. Indian healthcare is going to be $1 trillion, 1/4 of the United States and soon, right? So it's a pretty large industry. Indian healthcare is also attracting almost 70 other countries. Patients from other countries come to India for treatment, right? So we looked at that as a model and said, okay, let's launch it. It's a pretty large market. Then the other one, of course, is Germany from a reimbursement perspective. They're still playing with it. It's still in the early stage, but we are very happy where that the DIGA regulations have gone in Germany. That's something that we are looking at closely to get us there. We are not CE marked yet. We haven't cleared in Europe yet. So we still only FDA. India, we got clearance too. So we had to work on that phase of it. Initially, regulatory clearance in Europe, and then Germany is our next market. Okay, look.
Yeah, no, sounds good. Sounds good. Hopefully, yeah, hopefully in the near future, maybe whilst you're building one of your offices in Germany or in Europe, I can pop by and have a visit in person and discuss things around. Um,
Yeah, we have a hands full right now. In the US also, we just launched in 3 states, Massachusetts, New York, and Florida. 3 states we have launched. We have a partner now in California who's launching a pelvic floor. Uh, it's we are just starting out, right? We just had our insurance reimbursement. So to answer your question, we are actually currently reimbursed by insurance. So we worked on for 2 years. Uh, we worked on some different models, and now we are reimbursed even by Medicare as a service. So we can go to market. So that's what we're doing right now. So we are launching one state at a time in Ashes.
Wonderful. I think that's just how things go, one step at a time, towards advancement in technology and also advancements within life sciences healthcare, but also impacts for patients. Wonderful. So, Siva, thanks so much. I think it's been a wonderful discussion. I think I might bring things to a close. Two questions. One, are there any additional thoughts you want to share? And then secondly, as the co-founder of JOGO Health, if people would want to reach out to you and contact you, where's the best place to get in touch and to contact yourself?
Yeah, a website is a good place to go for us to learn about the science, and we have a lot of peer-reviewed publications on our website if somebody wants to look at the evidence. And also, there's some nice videos where we explain how it works. And the TED video I talked about neuroplasticity, that is a good one to watch. You can watch it directly on YouTube as well. Reaching out to me, of course, my email is the best way, siva@jogohealth.com, or LinkedIn is a good place. I'm active, you know that, Alan,
Yeah.
on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is always a good place. I always respond to people, other than some vendors who wanted to sell me IT resources. That's the only thing I don't want to be good at that. But definitely, LinkedIn is a good place, or you can reach out to me at siva@jogohealth.com. The SIVA@jogohealth.com. Yeah.
Perfect. Wonderful. So, yeah, again, to the audience, thank you so much for watching, or depending on the platform you're using, listening to this podcast. Siva, it's been wonderful having you as a guest. Please do reach out, or feel free to reach out to Siva. Also, if you're watching this on YouTube, please do like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment as well about some of your thoughts about this podcast and some of the trends within the life sciences industry. I look forward to listening, to speaking to all of you in the near future. Thanks.
Thank you, Alan. It was a pleasure talking to you. Yeah. Thank you. Good luck. Yeah. I have to subscribe to your channel. I haven't yet, so I have to.
Thanks. Appreciate it.